name is Radhika, as Sonia mentioned, and welcome to today's webinar on positivity in a professional environment. So I'd like to get started, and we're going to move on to the next slide. I'd like to start off with a quick overview of what our next hour is going to look like. So I'm going to start off with a quick introduction about myself, who I am, and why I'm here today. Then we're going to look at positivity, the benefits affiliated with positivity, as well as the cognitive cycle behind it. Furthermore, we're going to also discuss how communication and resiliency feeds into a positive environment. Furthermore, we're going to look into how building a personal brand image creates a positive outlook in the environment. There'll be a special Q&A period, as Sonia mentioned, and we're going to wrap it up with our close. So moving on to the next slide. So as I mentioned, my name is Radhika Khatri. I am a pooled fund specialist at CIBC Mellon. I've been working at the organization for just about 3 years now. Aside from my professional life, a couple of personal interests include reading self-help books. I've been privileged to also attend a couple coaching sessions that were tied to these self-help books. Furthermore, I also am a dance instructor at the YMCA. I do fitness training. And aside from that, I enjoy traveling, which I unfortunately haven't had an opportunity to do so in the last little while. Moving on. So a couple of benefits affiliated with being positive. First and foremost, it enhances your relationships with your peers and coworkers. And it's not just limited, being positive isn't just limited to your peers and coworkers. It's almost, the analogy I like to give to that is almost like filling up a bottle with water. When it starts to overflow, it goes everywhere. It goes to everyone that's around you. It goes to everyone in your reach. And positivity does the exact same. When you and every cell in your body is filled with positivity, it does the exact same. It'll start, it'll start going into, you'll see it ripple into those around you as well. Furthermore, it also helps bridge the gap between your goals and where you are today. In addition to that, it also improves your mental and physical health. And last but not least, you become more resilient in states of stress. And this is a little topic that we're going to be looking at a bit more in depth in slides to come. Moving on. So understanding the cognitive cycle is really important to understanding positivity. So ultimately everything starts with our thoughts, which thereafter become our beliefs. And based on our beliefs, feelings are generated. And based on our feelings, we perform actions, and thereafter we see results. So if we're not seeing the results that we want, we must go to the source itself, which is our thoughts. And that's exactly what we're going to be analyzing today. So moving on to the next slide. So communication and resiliency. Communication and resiliency has become more important now than ever, especially because we've transferred into a digital environment. So in the next few slides, you'll see exactly how we could become better communicators and how we could become more resilient. So there's a quote by a famous figure by the name of Simon Sinek, who once said, "Communication is not about what we think. Communication is about ensuring others understand what we mean." And how can we ensure others understand what we're talking about or what we mean? And there's 4 ways the 4 points that are shown on the slide that will help us ensure that others understand what we are trying to communicate. So first and foremost, our physiology, our physical state. And I'd like to look into the art of negotiation for a quick second. So when we're negotiating, when negotiators are doing what I like to call a quick close, you'll see that they're often standing. However, if a negotiator is trying to transfer knowledge, so they're going to be in a state of presenting or transferring information, you'll see that their physical state is standing while others around them are sitting. Another great example is if they're trying to come to an agreement of some sort, you'll find that their physical state is sitting with everyone that they're trying to come to an agreement with. And in addition to that, if we look into physiology a little bit more, when a person is depressed or feeling unwell, you'll notice that their chin is dropped and their shoulders are down. On the flip side, if a person who is uplifted, you'll notice that their shoulders are rolled back and their chin is also lifted up. So physiology is really important when we're communicating things, especially when it comes to even a remote environment, right? But as we speak right now, we're in a remote environment as well. There is a transfer of some sort of physiology that's coming into place because you guys are able to see me. The next area I'd like to look into is choice of words. And real quick, I'm going to run you guys through an example so you better understand the concept of choice of words. So I'm going to ask everybody to do exactly as I say. For a quick second, everyone's going to close their eyes. And you are not going to think about purple paper. Now open your eyes and throw it in the chat box if you would. What's the first thing that came across your mind? Real quick, just type it up and throw it in the chat box. What was the first thing that came into your mind? Purple paper, purple paper, purple paper, orange paper, but paper did come into your mind. Awesome. So when I told you not to think about something, why is it that most of us, not all of us, most of us thought about purple paper? Our brains are tailored to filter out the don'ts, the aren'ts, the isn'ts. So in states of stress, our brains will do exactly the same. We're going to look at this particular example a little bit more in depth in the slide to come. However, I'd like to move on to our next example, which is being clear and direct when we're communicating. So I'd like to start off with being clear. And to best showcase this, I'd like to share a story. Sonia, sorry, we're going to flip back to the previous slide. We're still. So clear, and to understand the concept of clear, I'd like to run you guys through a quick example. So in one of the webinars I attended with a coach, a few seats down from me, there was a gentleman that was sitting, and my coach goes to him, he approaches him, and he says, "Tell me anything that it is that you want." So the gentleman sits there and thinks, and he says, "I want more money." So my coach reaches into his pocket, takes out all the loose change and puts it on his table. And he says, "Here's more money." There was about 25 cents of change that came out of his pocket. But one thing that we need to learn about this is that he was not clear on what he wanted. He didn't want just 25 cents. He wanted more money. He wanted an exact amount and more. We've heard of the concept of SMART goal setting, but when we're communicating, we need to be SMART. SMART is an abbreviation that's just abbreviated for being specific, being measurable, being attainable, relevant, and time-based. Whether it's us communicating to ourselves, when we're telling ourselves we want more money, but we're not giving ourselves an exact amount, we're not giving ourselves an exact date that we want this by, we are not being clear on our communication. In addition to that, we also need to ensure that we need to be direct when we're communicating. Very so often when we are communicating, we only address people with their names when they've done something wrong. We need to also ensure that we are addressing individuals with their names when they also have done something that's rewarding, once they've done you a personal favor. So it needs to be specific and direct. So an example could be, you could say, "Thank you, Radhika, for," or "Thank you, so-and-so for." Addressing somebody with their name, there's a personal rapport that each individual has with their name. So when we start using individual's name, we create a rapport. And when a rapport is created, a relationship tends to flourish. And the very last point I'd like to touch base on is learning modalities. So what are modalities? Modalities is just a fancier word that's used to address our 5 senses. Ideally, people perceive information out of the 5 senses in a different format, right? So people have a dominant. So some individuals ideally use, their visual. Some use their auditory and others use their kinesthetic. There are the other 2 senses, however, these are the 3 most dominant. Not to say that everyone doesn't use all 5 senses, but everyone has a dominant in order in which they perceive information. And if an individual is matching and mirroring, we're doing the exact same. We are creating a rapport. Now, it's really important to understand all of these, but I'd like to focus in on two particular ones. One, which is our choice of words, and the other is our modalities. So moving on to the next slide. So choice of words. So if you could see in this next slide, I've created some sort of a template that we could recognize where we can switch our language. So as we saw with the purple paper example, that a lot of people thought about purple paper when they were explicitly told not to. Therefore, we need to transition our words from lacking energy to more uplifting energy. So instead of saying no problem, right, because the subject is problem, we could say you're welcome. Instead of saying I am sick, we can say I don't feel well, right? Instead of saying I forgot, we can say I didn't remember. And here's a real interesting one. Good morning. What does it mean to mourn? Historically, we've been using this term, but if we travel outside of the country and in some places in Europe, we'll hear the word great risings. For centuries, we've always been told that mourning is to mourn. And sometimes these hidden synonyms play a role and toll in our brain that we don't ideally recognize. Not to say that we should change, saying, instead of going from, saying good morning to saying great risings, though we have to ensure our intention is there. And the return of your intention is extremely powerful. So in the instance, you also do say any of the lack of energy words, we have to ensure that there is a powerful intention in place. If we are saying good morning, we have to ensure that the intention that's embedded in the words is uplifting. Now I'd like to move on to the next slide, where I'd like to explain the concept of learning modalities. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, it's important for us to recognize what another individual's dominant modality is. And your question is probably, how can we tell what someone's modality is? So here's a chart that explains how we could recognize what an individual's dominant modality is. If an individual's dominant modality is being visual, their speech will be a lot faster. They'll use metaphors such as, you see where I'm coming from. And their eyes tend to squint during a story. And that's ideally because they're trying to visualize at the back of their brain what story is being said. Moving to the auditory-driven modality, right? Their speech tends to be a little bit slower, and their words are a lot more selective. Auditory metaphors are used, such as, you hear where I'm coming from, or that sounds right. Eyes are tilted towards the bottom right, and their ear is moving towards the listener. And last but not least, we have our kinesthetic driven individuals. Their speech tends to be the slowest out of all the three, and ideally because everything is based on feelings. They're trying to put words to their feelings. Kinesthetic metaphors are also used, such as, let's touch base later. Eyes will move to the bottom left, therefore towards your heart, to understand, to again communicate what they're feeling. And to better explain this, and I want to ensure that everyone grasps a true understanding of this entire concept, I'd like to share a quick story. So the story starts off with a couple, right? And you're probably wondering, why is it that we're talking about a couple when we're looking at a business, we're looking at embedding positivity in the business environment. What I want to explain before I even get into the story is that positivity and understanding how relationships work, right? It's universal. If you can get it in one area, you could practically nail it in every area. These are universal principles, and therefore, if you understand the concepts of it, you can apply it to any area of your life and in any relationship of your life. So there's a couple, and ideally when a couple start off in what we call a honeymoon phase, everything's perfect. Everything's perfect, ideally because all five senses are being used. We've got our visuals. So when gifts are being exchanged, when individuals are taking, each other to places, right? That's the articulation of a visual, right? There's a there's a big misconception. You know, some people think that visual individuals are materialistic. Not necessarily. It's because they see something is being given to them, and that's where gratification kicks in. For auditory, you know, auditory in the honeymoon phase, auditory, the auditory modality kicks in because, you know, they're telling each other that they love each other. And for kinesthetic, gestures are used, right? And so forth. So in the honeymoon phase, this couple starts off with ideally using all five senses. Over time, what happens is all five senses start to, you know, suppress, and the person's dominant modality starts to surface. So this couple eventually ends up getting married, and one, you know, a few days in a row consecutively, they come home from work, and this seems to be the conversation. The husband comes home and tells his wife that he loves her. And she says, you know what, you're all talk, you're cheap, and so forth. And he says, what do you mean? I always tell you that I love you. Can anyone tell me what the husband's dominant modality is? Auditory. Now the wife goes back to him and she says, no, you don't love me. You don't take me places anymore. You don't buy me things anymore. And what we can see that's happening over here is that there's a conflict between what modality is ideally being used. And now that the specific stimuli that creates the rapport, right, is no longer being used. And therefore, relationships over time start to deteriorate. Like I said, these are universal principles and they can be applied in any relationship, whether it's your relationship with your client, whether it's your relationship with your coworkers, your peers. If you understand what their dominant modalities are and how they perceive information, and goes back right back to Simon Sinek's quote, we need to ensure that others understand what we mean, right? And one of the best ways of doing it is learning their dominant modalities. And that pretty much wraps up understanding modalities. There's an entire book about this, which I'll be giving more details about towards the end of the presentation. But for now, I'd like to move on to our next topic, which is building resiliency. So ideally, there's two ways that we can become more resilient in a professional environment. For one, it's responding versus reacting, and the other is practicing gratitude. So let's first look at the responding versus reacting chain. Moving on to the next slide. Thank you, Sonia. So ideally, how the responding versus reacting chain looks is a person or an individual will have a behavior. Let's say it's a bad behavior. Therefore, it has an impact on the receiver, right? That now influences their behavior, which therefore has an impact on another individual's behavior, right? And what we can see over here, if we are in a reactive phase, this will become easily a vicious circle. However, at some point, if we choose to break this chain and we choose to respond versus react, right, it'll change the entire environment and we'll move towards what we call a positive environment. So ways to identify how we can respond versus react, we're going to look a little bit more into that in the next slide. So responding versus reacting. So if an individual is reacting to something, they're in what I like to call a flight or fight mode. They're completely on autopilot. They are very triggered. Their responses are very impulsive. However, if they are in a responsive phase, their responses are very timed, they're well thought through, right? And they outweigh the advantages and disadvantages of what they're going to say and the impact that it'll have on a certain individual. Every time every time a stimuli comes your way, you have a split second in deciding whether you're going to respond to something or whether you're going to react to something. So ideally, if we move towards responding, if we take that split second to, outweigh the advantages real quick, and this all happens, real quick in your brain versus just reacting, we'll move towards what we call a positive environment. Moving on to the next slide. Understanding gratitude. So gratitude has showcased, scientifically to have increased lifespans and so forth. But understanding it in a professional environment, I have 4 points I'd like to share with you. So first of all, it increases your work performance and satisfaction. In addition to that, it results in a balanced lifestyle. So originally and historically, we've been always presented with a balanced lifestyle as, allocating 25% of your energy to work and performance, and allocating another 25% to your relationships and your family, another 25 to your health and wellness and so forth, right? And over the years, self-help coaches have, redesigned that entire model. It shouldn't be just 25%, 25%, and 25%. It should be 100%. We should be allocating 100% to our work and performance. We should be allocating 100% to our family and our relationships. We should be allocating 100% to our health and wellness. And ideally, because, there's a saying that if we live in the present, we'll be able to give our most. And this saying is true because when we're living in the present, we are completely involved in what we are doing. And that's what gratitude will help us achieve. In addition to that, studies have shown that it improves our relationship. However, for every one complaint, whether it's a complaint through thought, whether it's a complaint through word, or whether it's a complaint through an action, we need to have an offsetting 10 grateful thoughts, words, or actions to create some sort of normalness in the relationship. If you don't, the relationship is likely to deteriorate. So every time you have any sort of negative thought about somebody, and I've made this practice, I would actually write down 10 grateful things about that person. Or in any instance that we accidentally say something that we shouldn't have, I do the exact same, and so forth. And last but not least, it creates a charismatic personality as well as a compelling one. People will be more drawn towards you when you start practicing gratitude rather than the opposite. So your question is, how can I practice gratitude? And we'll be looking into that in the next slide. Thank you. So first and foremost, we can journal. Journaling has been proven to have changed lives. And I know a lot of people think this is just fluff, the law of attraction, this and that. But there's a science behind why journaling is effective. There's an X number of kinetics involved when we are handwriting something, and therefore that drives power to our unconscious mind. When we are writing something down, it's the transfer of what's in your brain coming out, and an X number of kinetics are used. And a quick example to showcase why this is actually true. You ever find yourself when you're working out in a gym, right? You're moving your entire body because there's a whole number of kinetics that are involved, and you're listening to the song. When you come home, back from the gym, that's the song that'll constantly keep playing in your brain. That's why writing something down, right, does the exact same, because an X number of kinetics are involved from moving from the thought all the way down into physical, tangible form. Another concept to understand is, I'm no fan, to be completely honest, of old adages or old sayings, because I genuinely think they're overused. But have you ever heard of this saying, "Can I have this in writing?" The reason why we crave to have things in writing is ideally because there's a form of certainty. There's a form of assurance, right? And these overused sayings have been overused for a specific reason, and that's because they are true. Moving to the next point, the thank you mantra, right? What differentiates a mantra from a set of words? It's repetition. When we repeat something enough times, it almost becomes second nature for us to practice it. And not only just that, it helps us understand the energy that lives behind the words, right? And this does the exact same, right? It goes right into our unconscious mind. And last but not least, we can test ourselves, and I like to call it the gratitude test. Ask yourself the following questions. So I've thrown up on the screen 3 questions, and evaluate yourself from a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being the worst and 10 being the best. Where do you stand on the scale of gratitude. So the first one, we're looking at our work. The second one, we're looking at our relationships. And the third one, we're looking at ourselves. For a quick second, I'll give you guys 2 minutes to just ask yourself these questions and write this down, and where you feel as though you stand. Be honest to yourself. You know, nobody's going to be looking at that paper that you're writing on, but be honest with yourself. Where do you think you stand? And evaluate yourself real quick. I'll give you guys a minute to do so. Okay, now that we've tested ourselves, now what we need to ensure we do is we fill that gap. There's a number of ways that we fill each and every individual gap, and the answer is in the question itself, right? Are we grateful for every time we receive a paycheck? Are you truly grateful when you receive your salary? There's a number of ways that we can be doing it. Are you truly grateful when your relationships are flourishing? And last but not least, are we grateful when our health is fantastic and going great? So these are a few ways of how we can be a little bit more grateful, and how this, and as I mentioned, this helps us feed into what I like to call a positive environment. Now I'd like to move on to our next topic, which is building a personal brand image. So far what we've discussed is how we can ultimately better ourselves. Now that we've accomplished that, now that we've found ways that we can better ourselves, we want to ensure that this energy floods to each and every individual around us. And how can we establish that? So if we move on to the next slide, we can see that there's ultimately 3 different ways we can establish that. 1, being a leader. 2, performing acts of giving. And last but not least, creating a community of impact. So let's look at the first topic, which is leadership. We can move to the next slide. Thank you. So leadership is entirely a topic of its own. You know, I could have created an entire presentation on this, but it's really important. It plays a pivotal role when it comes to creating a positive environment. So one of my mentors recently shared a story from his previous employer where they had every employee in the organization take a leadership course. And one thing that I took out of that is that leaders aren't necessarily your managers, and managers aren't necessarily your leaders. This isn't to pinpoint anyone or, you know, saying if you're a manager, you're not necessarily a leader, but leadership comes when leaders begin to breed more leaders. Right? If you are bringing the best out of somebody else, you have breeded another leader. If you are creating a person of impact, you have breeded another leader. In addition to that, leaders serve others before they serve themselves. And there's a number of needs that a leader can ideally serve, and that's made in reference to Maslow's hierarchy. So ideally, a human ideally has 5 underlying major needs, which is our physical needs, our safety needs, our need of being loved and belonged, our esteem needs, and self-actualization. Right? If an individual is serving any of those needs of theirs before they serve of yours before they serve their own, they are showcasing true leadership, and that's what we want to ensure that we're doing. Right? We should be creating an environment of selflessness, giving to others before we give our own. And last but not least, leaders use languages of inclusiveness, right? They use words such as we instead of I. They use words such as let's go instead of go. So moving on to our next slide, which is creating and performing acts of giving. So there's a quote by a famous figure by the name of Frederick Lenz once said, "Selfless giving is the art of living." When I was smaller, I always thought that we can only give money to individuals or gifts purchased through money. As I grew older, I understood that money isn't the only thing that we can give to individuals. We can also give time to individual, and that's an art of giving. We can give well thoughts, and that's an act of giving. And if we do any of these selflessly, and when I say selflessly, there's no personal agenda involved. There's nothing in it for us, right? People can ideally see when you're exchanging gifts, they can see that you're giving them something, right? The same goes with time. They can see that you're giving them time. But well thoughts go beyond anything because nobody will be watching you, with the exception of the mentalists that can actually read your brains, but nobody will be watching you when you give well thoughts to somebody. I can promise you it will come back to us in folds, right? And that's only given the fact that we're doing it truly selflessly. There should never be a personal agenda involved. Hey, hey, if I give this to somebody, right, they should be giving this in turn back to me, right? And we've been living in this we've been doing this unfair barter for years. We've been giving somebody something and always expecting something in return. That return will come back to you, maybe from a different person, but it will definitely come back to us, right? And there's ideally, like I mentioned, 3 forms of giving. We could give individuals money or gifts purchased from money. We can give individuals our time. And last but not least, we can also give other individuals well thoughts. So moving on to our very last topic for today, which is creating a community of impact. So once we start creating a community of impact, again, selflessly, we will create lasting impressions. In addition to that, it will create the ripple effect. And it goes, hand in hand with that concept of us overflowing, right? And last but not least, we'll be operating from a stance of abundance. So just before, just after this presentation is done, I'd like to set us all off on an impact challenge. We go out of our ways to create an impact. It doesn't have to be something huge, but it could be anything. And we've discussed 3 forms of giving. We're going to go outside and we're going to create an impact in somebody else's lives. And I'd love to hear and learn about the stories of how we've gone out of our ways to create an impact in somebody's lives. I'll be sharing both my email address and LinkedIn shortly to discuss, and please do share with me and discuss how you've gone out of your way. I'd love to hear the stories of how we're going to do this. And I myself haven't thought of exactly what I'm going to do, but I'm going to join you guys on the impact challenge. So this does bring us close to the end of our presentation. And as I promised, I will be sharing some recommended reads. So I'd like to go to the next slide so we can show some books. So The Unlimited Power, it's a book by Tony Robbins, goes really into depth about learning modalities. It shares, I've really just scratched the surface right now, but if you want to understand the entire concept of modalities, it's actually tied to NLP, which is abbreviated for neuro-linguistic programming. If you are interested in learning more about how we can shift our words, a great read is Every Word Has Power by Yvonne Oswald. Furthermore, if you're interested in learning how you can master the art of practicing gratitude, The Magic has a 28-day course, and it helps you identify each area of our lives, and it will help us achieve a rhythm of what I like to call gratitude. And last but not least, a recent read, and it's a terrific read, which is a book by Simon Sinek. It's called Leaders Eat Last. If you're interested in learning a lot more about leadership, that's a great read. And, it really goes into depth about how to be a great leader and how to create an environment of having leaders surrounded by you. So I'd now like to open up the floor for any questions. We could also go to the next slide. And Sonia, if you could share some questions with me.
Thank you so much, Radhika. That was great. So everyone, you can start typing your questions into the Q&A tab. We have a question here already. Does journaling have to be by pen, or is electronic writing or typing it up okay as well? Or maybe like making a note on your phone?
So that's a great question. So as I mentioned in the presentation itself, there's an X number of kinetics that are involved. So there's more movement in your body when we are handwriting something. So when we're typing something, it is effective because we are still having motions involved. But when we are handwriting something, a lot more motions are involved. And therefore, the answer to your question is it's best if we handwrite something. That said, I know technology has also given us the opportunity to have those e-journals online. So I know on iPads, they have like those pens where we can actually write. And that also uses the same number of kinetics, just as we would be doing when we're, using a pen and paper. So ideally, it's best if we handwrite our goals or handwrite while we're practicing gratitude or journaling.
Thank you so much, Radhika. That's like new to me too. So I'm glad that question was asked. Thank you for the question. I'll give everyone a few moments to quickly type some questions into the Q&A tab. Until then, I'll leave this on for people to see. Unless, Radhika, do you want to go over some of these?
So these are basically the references and the books that we've already shared in the previous tab, and these are additional links if you're interested in learning more about Maslow's hierarchy and understanding the human, other human needs. A couple of the books, like I mentioned, were The Magic from Rhonda Byrne, and they're more or less just a repetition of references in APA format.
Thank you. Well, we don't have any questions right now, but if that's something does come up, you know where to contact Radhika. So I'll just go back to the slide here. Oh, we've got a question here. Fantastic presentation, Radhika. And how do you ensure that other people go out of their way to help? Okay, I'm just going to try to read this. How do you ensure other people go out of their way to help? No, you came from a genuine place. Okay, so if you're going out of your way to help somebody, how do you ensure that they know that you're coming from a genuine place? Like there is no strings attached, you're genuinely trying to help them.
How is the question is how does the other individual know?
Or how do you let them know? How would you ensure that they're aware that you're just genuinely trying to help? There's nothing that you want in return.
Okay, so one way of doing is ensuring that you communicate it, right? You can say, I'm doing this genuinely for you, right? But over time, people will recognize it, right? These relationships that we have with individuals, right, don't form overnight, right? We've got to prove it's almost about proving ourselves to them, right? And once we do that, it goes the same way. How would you know that somebody's coming from a genuine spot, right? It's over time. It's something that's accumulated, and it's not something that happens overnight. When they have enough experiences stacked with them that showcase that you've done that, either you've proven to them visually, whether you've proven it to them through your words, or whether you've proven it through them through kinesthetically by doing genuine favors, they'll come to that conclusion themselves. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much, Radhika. And that makes a lot of sense. And now I'm just thinking about how I'm able to recognize these people in my workplace, and I just have a different perspective on now. Another comment, excellent webinar. Thank you so much for inspiring everyone. The question here is, how do you create an impression in an interview when it comes to express positivity?
Sorry, I think I lost you there for a second. How is it?
How do you create an impression in an interview when it comes to express positivity?
When it comes to expressing positivity. So it goes back to the concept of modalities, right? So one way of doing it is ensuring that your physiology is also there, right? So you want to ensure that you're sitting straight, you're using hand gestures when you're speaking as well. In addition to that, what I personally have done before interviews, you're usually given a name of the individual. So I would write 10 things I'm grateful for about the person before I even meet the person. So this kind of sounds weird because it's like, how can we be grateful for somebody before we've even met them? Right. So one way of doing it is first and foremost, they've given you an opportunity. They've given you the opportunity to have an interview, right? So that's a place to start, and we can start going from there, right? Look at the email, see the words that they've used, and so forth, right? And positivity is more or less an energy. And when you have done that, it's almost like you've prepared yourself when you walked in. You'll give off an energy to the person that's receiving the information, right? And when you're even at the interview, when you want to ensure that you create a rapport of some sort, right? And it goes back to, like I said, the modality piece as well. Look at how the person that's asking you the question is are they speaking fast, right? If they're fast speakers, that means they're visual. If they're speaking a little bit slower and their ears are tilted a little bit towards you, that means they are auditory, and so forth, right? So if you go back to even the presentation and understand how each individual perceives their information, you'll create a rapport, and therefore a ripple into positivity. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you so much. What's the best way to figure out a person's preferred way to receive gratitude? Is it like auditory, visual, kinesthetic? How would you figure that out?
How to receive it, right? So ideally, like I said, when we understand the opponent's dominant force, and like I said, there's 3 ways of ideally understanding it. And if you want to really learn a lot more about understanding the concept of modalities, I strongly recommend you read The Unlimited Power by Tony Robbins, because he really goes into it, and he even trains individuals on NLP, which is neuro linguistic programming. And what this ideally does is, sorry, I think I lost the question here. Sorry, Sonia, I think I lost the question here. You could repeat it for me for a second.
Yes, I will. Here. Are you able to see it? What's the best way to figure out a person's preferred way to receive gratitude?
Yeah. So the answer is really learning that individual's modality, right? So if the individual is driven by visuals, right, they're obviously going to want to have gifts. They're going to there needs to be some sort of visual gratification that's involved in the process. If they are a person who's driven by their modality that's driving them is their auditory, the words will give them gratification. So you want to ensure that you're exchanging words, right? And so forth, right? So those are ideally the best ways of doing it. And like I mentioned earlier as well, it's, if you really want to understand this concept of modalities, the book Unlimited Power shares a number of concepts and different ways of how we can ensure that we're using the correct one.
Thank you. Next question here is, words have power. So how do you deal with negative words?
How do we deal with negative words? So ideally, people around us are not going to, in an environment, we're not going to have people using the words that we want them to use, right? But what happens over time is these words would change when we start creating rapport with individuals, right? The words that, the conversations that you will have, right? The tonality and everything will start to change over time, right? If, like, ultimately, I like to say that change starts with us. If we make the initiative to change, if we choose to, if you're having a hardship relationship, write 10 things you're grateful about for that person, right? If you can't find one, we've got to do some, internalizing and some reflection. Okay, well, there has to be something that I'm grateful for that person, right? And once you start creating that list, we start creating change around us. And that's ideally how words around us would begin to change as well.
Thank you. And the next question is more, I guess, of a personal setting, not as much as a work setting, but I can understand how this can be a work setting as well. How would you advise helping someone who finds it hard to be positive at all and constantly focuses on the negatives?
How would you recommend? So ideally, I'm going to be completely honest with you, I was the exact same myself before. Once I picked up the book of The Magic, it's a 28-day course, right? And if you follow through on this 28-day course, you will find yourself being more positive naturally. It almost will become second nature for you. So if you're worried about, you're somebody naturally who isn't necessarily positive or finds it challenging to be positive, when you start writing, let alone just writing, you start using those kinetics, right? When you start transferring what's here down here, and it'll be an entire game changer. You'll find yourself naturally being more positive without even recognizing you're doing it.
Thank you. And I guess foul language wouldn't be acceptable in the workplace in the first place. But how do you avoid using foul language, I guess?
So is this from a personal stance? I just wanted a little bit
Or
clarification.
probably, because you wouldn't be able to use foul language in the workplace.
So I think Sonia answered that question for me, but yeah, we shouldn't be using foul language in the workplace at all, right? How do we fix that? We've got to, again, change starts with us. So we've got to ensure that we start changing our personal vocabulary. And ideally, that's the best way of doing it, right? Like start reading books that have more positive and surrounding yourself with more positive and uplifting videos even. So you start building a rhythm for yourself to shift away from those words.
Thank you. I think we're at the end of our questions here. If there are any questions that come up, you see Radhika's information on the screen here. Radhika, do you want to end off with anything?
Yes, I do. So I wanted to say thank you to everyone who has joined the webinar today. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed putting it together. I'd like to also take this opportunity to say thank you to CIBC Mellon for organizing and coordinating with ACCESS Employment and giving employees the opportunity to volunteer in organizations as such. Also, a huge thanks to my team for supporting me. We've been super short-staffed, and they've been a great help. They're covering me right now as well. So huge thank you to you guys. Also, thank you to my mentors who have contributed to this presentation in ways in which I'm sure you've seen, and perhaps you might not recognize it, but you guys have definitely had a huge role to play in this presentation alone. And also huge thank you to Sonia and all of ACCESS Employment for coordinating programs like these. I think you guys have done a phenomenal job on really transferring information to several individuals, and I truly think it's an amazing initiative. So thank you once again to everybody, and I truly appreciate all the efforts that have been put in it, and thank you for also sharing 1 hour of your day today with me.